which means fact, on the Israeli channel 2. Dayan was born in Argentina in 1964, and she immigrated to Israel with her family at age of 6 in 1970, and settled in Yad Eliyahu neighborhood in Tel Aviv. Dayan attended the Tel Aviv University School of Law, and after her internship, she traveled to the United States to receive a PhD in law from the Yale University.
Nobody is perfect.
During her studies there, she also wrote a bi-weekly column for Yediot Achronot, which is the biggest newspaper in Israel. During her studies there, on her return to Israel, she began teaching courses in constitutional law in the Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law, where she still teaches as a visiting lecturer. In November 1993, when the Israeli Channel 2 was launched, she started hosting her television program, Uvda. And it is the only program still being broadcasted on that channel for such a long time. Today, Dayan also presents a morning program on current affairs for the Israeli Army Radio. Dayan also voted number 106 in Ynet's list of 200 greatest Israelis, and was chosen the most influential woman in the Israeli culture in the 2008 Women Festival in Holon. Please join me in welcoming Ilana Dayan.
Given the list that Sofian cited, I still have a way to go. But I have to tell you that she correctly analogized our program, Uvda, as the easiest way to describe it is what we call the Israeli 60 Minutes, but I have a son who for many years now, whenever he's asked, he says that 60 Minutes is the American answer to Uvda. So that's the way it is. I gotta tell you, I'm just coming from a meeting much like this one, but with a smaller forum of officers in the Israeli military, officers in a certain command, many of whom I know for many years, and they wanted to hear a little bit about the relationship between the military and the media and stuff that is always interesting for them. And I was reminded by a something like 10 years ago, just after Operation Cast Lead, one of those rounds of violence in Gaza, the Parachuters Brigade decided to do a special meeting after the war ended. And the commander of the Parachuter Brigade, who is, by the way, now the commander of Southern Command in the military, in the Israeli military, he invited me to kind of moderate a discussion between his junior officers. And he asked all of the junior officers to come with an example of a dilemma that they had during the fighting, a dilemma that had to do with moral issues of morality in fighting. And it was kind of okay, and just after it ended, I was on my way out. Listen, I have to tell you something. I had an incident in Gaza in which you were on my veins. I kind of felt you here. I said, what happened? And he said, we were fighting in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and all of a sudden there was fire. And one of my junior officers was ahead of me. And I knew that if the fire continues, he might be hurt, he and his guys. There was a house there of a Palestinian family. I couldn't tell if the fire was coming from within the house. I had to make a decision, and this was a 20-year-old junior officer. I had to make a decision whether to bring a tank and bring the house down, and I could already envision your report on television. If innocent people are in there, if the fire didn't come from within the house, and I bring the house down with a tank, I can already see in my imagination your report on television. But if I don't do it, and if indeed the fire came from within the house, and my guys are hurt, then I will not be able to forgive myself. I said, Yuda, what did you do? And he said, I waited for a couple of minutes, and then I realized the fire was not coming from within the house, and I didn't bring the house down. And I said, listen, I have no problem modeling your inner voice. given that nobody will let me model anything else. I have no problem being your model, but it wasn't me, it was you. It was you. And you made the call. You made a professional call, an operational call, a conscientious call, but it was you, it wasn't me. And if I had to be the proxy for your inner voice, if I had to be the agent for your conscience, so be it. I will be glad to do it anytime. I'm available for it anytime. But it wasn't me, it was you. Now guys, listen, this was not a correct answer. It was not a full answer. Because the truth is that he was indeed worried of the possibility that he makes a mistake, innocent people pay with their lives, and there is a report on television. Now the question is, was he afraid of the possibility that innocent lives will be lost, or is he afraid of the report on television? Are both the same? I'm telling you this story not because there's a short answer to the dilemma. If there is, then there's no dilemma and there's no interest in discussing it. I'm telling you it because you can look at it and it's the story of this country. It's the story of this journey of yours. You can look at it as the story of a conscientious officer trying to do the right thing. And you can look at it as a story about an officer who perceives the media as an unnecessary nuisance, right? And that's the way you can perceive Israel. You can perceive Israel as the most democratic nation among those threatened. And you can perceive it as the most threatened nations among those who are democratic. It's true, and this is true. And in a way, I will try to convey to you the story of the Israeli paradox, or the Israeli dichotomy, or the Israeli schizophrenia, and not go, I bet that other people will tell you the intricacies of the conflict and the intricacies of Israeli day-to-day life. I will try to take you back in time and higher in space, as much, it sounds too pretentious, I guess, but I will try. I will try. And I will try to tell you the story of our lives personally, as journalists. If you take the story of my dialogue with Yuda, you know, I can tell the story of us Israelis fighting a just war and nonetheless still expose the prices of this war. The prices in terms of morality, the prices in terms of oppression of another people, the prices in terms of innocent lives. I can tell the story of a just war and still report its prices. And vice versa. I can also detect the flaws of Israeli existence and the prices and the toll that it takes and still realize, and this is the most important point that I want to make, I can detect the flaws of Israeli existence. I can be a critical journalist. I can do this report that Yuda doesn't want me to do and still realize, and I do realize, that the miracle of the existence of the state of Israel, being the national home for the Jewish people, being a democratic and Jewish country in this area of ours, is a miracle that is unparalleled, that I know nothing like it. Now I want to take you into my personal story. As Sofian rightly mentioned, I was not born here. I was born in Argentina. My parents were both born in South America. My father was born in Argentina. My mother was born in Uruguay. Their parents came to South America from Europe. My father's parents from the Ukraine, and my mother's parents from Hungary, before the war, before the Holocaust. And I remember when we made Aliyah, when we came to this country, I remember that my father said something which I will never forget, because he repeated it many, many times afterwards, as fathers often do. He said the following: when my parents, so he said, when my parents left Europe, they left Europe with a curse on their lips. He was speaking Spanish. He said, con una maldición en sus labios. I bet Northern California also gets some Spanish, right? Con una maldición en sus labios. My parents, he said, left Europe with a curse on their lips. I am leaving South America, he said, with a blessing on my lips. Because South America was good to Jewish people, much like North America. And we were not persecuted. There was hardly any anti-Semitism. But the story of his parents moving to South America and my parents moving to Israel is the story of the Jewish people. And the story is basically this one. This is the story that my father was trying to tell. The story is basically always the same. Most Jewish families, you will hear the same story. Families that came to Ellis Island, to New York, to Cuba, to South America, to Israel, to Palestine. Somebody was out there to get us, there in Europe, or there in Arab countries. Somebody was out there physically to kill us. And we came here so that we don't die anymore. As simple as that. This is the basic, most accurate definition of Zionism. Somebody was out there to kill us, and we came to a place where there will be nobody who can kill us. But Zionism can bring you that far. It could make Jewish history change in the sense that nobody will be able to kill us anymore. It cannot carry the promise of true, full, and deep normal life. This is the point in which I want you to pay attention. The Zionist dream was flawless, was perfect, as long as it was a dream. Anybody who ever got married, I don't know how many of you are married, knows that the dream is perfect as long as it is a dream. Once it's realized, it's not perfect anymore. This is the story of Zionism. Once it was realized and materialized into a national home to the Jewish people in this country, it stopped being perfect anymore. All of a sudden, we have territorial conflicts. We have religious conflicts. We have dilemmas of morality and conscience. All of a sudden, it's not flawless anymore. So Zionism could bring us that far. It could make it that we don't die anymore. It cannot carry the promise of us starting living a full and deep and normal life. In a way, this is what I'm trying to explain to you as far as the Israeli schizophrenia goes. Israelis, and I'm sure that you've already learned that, are very curious, somewhat nervous, somewhat impatient, and very, very democratic creatures by their DNA. At the same time, they are a threatened bunch of people. Threatened because of history. Threatened because of the story of these people. And when I'm trying to speak about the two parts of this schizophrenia, I want you to understand it deeper, the two parts of this schizophrenia. When I say that we are a truly, almost genetically, democratic nation, I mean that when you dive into, for instance, Israeli case law, you will notice that by 1953, this state was 5 years old. There was still martial law in parts of this country. The existential threat was as evident, as physical, as imminent as you can imagine. Only 5 years after the War of Independence, the Supreme Court of Israel issues a decision proclaiming and declaring the right for free speech and interpreting a law which didn't give any authority to the court to question the discretion of a minister to close a newspaper. That was the issue. Can the Minister of the Interior close a newspaper which ran an opposition article, okay? A pro-Arab, pro-communist article. I don't know if any of you, I guess some of you have legal education. In America by then, still decisions of the court, Whitney versus California, Cohen versus California, decisions which did not recognize the right of free speech, decisions that were overturned only in the 60s when the Warren Court was at its height, America was backwards. In Israel in 1953, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel writes a decision saying that the minister cannot close a newspaper just because the newspaper ran an anti-government, an opposition article. And the court is taking an authority which is not written by law. So he's interpreting very freely and very progressively and liberally the law. There you have it. And ever since, up until these days, the Israeli court has written our unwritten constitution, in terms of free speech, in terms of equal protection, in terms of equality between men and women, in terms of gays and lesbians, and in terms of equality between Arabs and Jews. Not that it's perfect, not that we're not fighting these wars, still fighting them in the court and otherwise. But there you have it, on the one hand. Israeli democracy is deeply rooted in the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court, and even deeper than that, in the dialogue that I have with this junior officer, in the way that people here accept the fact that nothing is taken for granted. Nothing can be taken for granted. You know, there's something that I remember always, an interaction that I had, I guess it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, after a terrible terrorist attack in a yeshiva in Jerusalem. It was a yeshiva of very young boys. 8 kids, ages 8 to 10, were killed, murdered in that terrorist attack. And I remember that the morning after the attack, the funerals took place. And the rabbi, his name was Yerachmiel Weiss, the rabbi of Yeshivat Merkaz Harav Letzeirim, he was standing on the 8 small coffins and scolding God. And he was saying, in Hebrew he said, Lama asita li ester panim? Why did you hide your face away from me? He was battling with God. He was arguing with God. He was challenging God. Why did you hide your face? Why did you went away from me? And that day in the evening, I did an interview, live interview with him inside the yeshiva where the walls were still stained with blood. And we ran a kind of half-an-hour interview that I did with the rabbi. And one of the first questions I asked him was, how come you, an Orthodox Jew, a rabbi, you scold God? Because we have in Hebrew a saying which is tziduk adin. We accept God's verdict. Hashem natan, Hashem lakach, yehi shem Hashem mevorach. That's what we say when somebody passes away. God has taken, God has given, be his name blessed. And I asked him, how did you say that? And he said, because we have the right to question God. Later we will accept his verdict. But we have the right to question God. And it's like a kid when his mother is not there and he's in trouble and he asks her, where did you go? Why were you not with me? That's what I asked God. I have the right to quarrel with him. This is part of the story of Israeli democracy. We quarrel, we debate, we argue. You know what they say, where there's 2 Jews, you have 4 opinions and half a dozen synagogues. So that's part of it. But now let's go to the bad news, to the darker side of the moon. As much as we are democratic, we are threatened. Guys, this is the other side of the coin. They say you are either democratic or Jewish, you are either democratic or non-democratic. No. In the case of Israel, on the other side of the democracy, of the other side of the democratic aspect of Israeli life, you have the threat. You have the fear. This is what lies on the other side of the equation. Israeli democracy is always in a contest with Israeli fear. And that fear is also a deep, existential, historic Jewish fear. It is the fear that accompanies us ever since we have met Jewish tragedy. You know, when I came to this country, there were still many, many people with a number on their arm. They were still living among us. Today you have very few Holocaust survivors. When I came to this country, they were still among us. In the kibbutz of my aunt, where we arrived when we just came to Israel, it was a kibbutz founded by Holocaust survivors from Poland. I will tell you in a while about, for me, the greatest Israeli author. His name is David Grossman. Perhaps some of you have heard about him or read any of his books. And he wrote once about an aunt of his. She was a Treblinka survivor. And he remembers, he all of a sudden realized a couple of days after his wedding that she came to his wedding with a Band-Aid on her arm, covering her number. And later he asked her, why did you come with a Band-Aid on your arm? And she said, because I didn't want to spoil your party. I wanted to leave the suffer away, to leave tragedy away. And when he wrote about it, he said, look at that. She wanted to leave tragedy away, but it's only a rip of a Band-Aid. And we are there. The number is still there, beneath the Band-Aid, behind the bandage. It's still there. It's just a rip of a Band-Aid, and you see it. There's another Israeli author whom I really recommend. I also recommend Grossman, a younger Israeli author. His name is Etgar Keret. He's from the newer generation, the younger generation. His parents are Holocaust survivors. And he told once the story of him at the age of 5 going to lunch with his mother. And he remembered that he was fussy. He was annoyed, he was fussy, he was crying, and he had complaints about everything. He was 5 years old. And then all of a sudden his mother told him, Edgar, listen, we're sitting in a restaurant. People around us are eating. They have knives and forks. Nobody is about to stab us. Nobody is about to do us anything bad. Let's sum it up as a good day. This is a good day. If nobody is out to get us, it means it's a good day. Yes, that's kind of the Polish way of passive-aggressive, to say, we're happy after all. You know what they say? These Polish Jewish women, they say, I will rest in my grave. Until then, I have no rest. Now, you have to understand, you have to understand that this anxiety, this fear is not just a Kamaic, metaphysical, historical, just a general fear. It's something which then translates itself to day-to-day life. 3 years ago, another round of violence broke in the streets of Jerusalem. We call it the Knives Intifada. It's still going on, but less so. And my younger son was then, I guess he was 15, 14, 15. And his high school was in Jerusalem. And I remember myself calling him almost every day and asking him, where is he? I'm in the bus station. So you know what? If you're in the bus station, make sure that you stick together with the other people. Because if somebody comes with a knife, so that you're with other people. And then I call him back and I say, no, Gonen, you know what? Keep away from other people. Because if somebody comes with a car and tries to run you over, you better be away from the group. Because he will look for a bunch of people. Now listen to this conversation. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's not like we live in Yemen. It's not like we are one of, the caravan threatened by President Trump. No, we live normal life. Gonen is a trumpet player. He was going to the music academy. This is the point of Israeli life. Normality is mixed with paranoia. Democracy is mixed with fear. Sanity is mixed with tragedy. This is the schizophrenia that I'm trying to tell you about. This is the dichotomy that when one understands Israeli life, this is the most important thing to understand. The both, the gam vegam, the this and that, both sides of the equation. And now the question is, where does it drive us? Where does it take us? Because what you have to understand, that those guys that I understand that Eilam took you to see them, the guys from the special units, the guys from Sayed, yes, they swear on the weapon. Yes, they are ready to die for this country. But then when they leave the army, they get high in Dharamsala, they enroll in Berkeley, and they want to start up at the startup. Eventually, that's the story. The story is a story of normality embroiled in craziness. This is the story. But now let's try to understand, where does it take us? And where are we now in this huge story that I'm trying to tell you? Last year, 2017, was the year of the anniversaries. Many, many anniversaries. It was the 100 years anniversary to the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, the declaration according to which the Jewish people is entitled to a national home in the land of Israel. This was the Balfour Declaration. 100 years to the Balfour Declaration. 70 years to the decision of the UN. The decision by the UN recognizing a Jewish state alongside an Arab state between the sea and the river. A declaration or a decision of the UN which the Arabs did not accept. Ever since we used to say that the Palestinians don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, The bad news is that Israelis also don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So you have 100 years anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, 70 years anniversary of the division decision, 50 years anniversary of the 6 Days War of 1967, which changed the state of Israel forever, made it bigger, stronger, but much more schizophrenic. Because as much as we became mightier, we became the oppressors and the occupiers. And we have to deal with that. But you know what was the most important anniversary? The most important anniversary was not Balfour, not the Division Declaration, not the 6 Days War 50-year anniversary. It was the 30 years anniversary to the breaking of the First Intifada, 1987, December 1987. This was the first time that Arabs, Palestinian Arabs in the territories, revolted. It was the first time in which Israelis realized that occupation cannot be here to stay. Even those who believe in our national and religious and historic and God-given right to this whole country, even those who believe in the dream of greater Israel, they realize, they know the truth. They know the truth. They know that this cannot stay forever. And the First Intifada was the first proof that Palestinians make it clear that this cannot last. But what happened next? Listen to the development of the events. The First Intifada brought upon this region the Oslo Accords, 1993, 4 years later. Finally, Israelis and Palestinians talk together, sit together, recognize each other, and recognize the right of one another to exist in two states, living one side the other. But then, a dangerous process began. Because for many Israelis, what happened after the Oslo Accords is for them the proof that perhaps occupation cannot last forever, but peace is not behind the corner either. Why? Because what happened after the Oslo Accords? A barrage of terrible terrorist attacks, which took place here in the streets of Tel Aviv in the spring of 1995 and 1996. What happened next? You have another attempt in the Camp David summit in the year 2000. Ehud Barak, Israeli Prime Minister, goes there and makes the most generous offer ever. The result was another round of violence, the second Intifada, more than 1,000 Israeli dead, suicide bombers, buses going up in the air, massacres in the streets of Israel, and many more Palestinian dead. What happened next? The next Israeli Prime Minister, Arik Sharon, realizes something has to be done. The solution cannot be a military one. The disengagement takes place. Israel pulls out of Gaza. What's the response? Another round of violence. Qassams and rockets and cornets falling on the heads of Israelis in the southern part of Israel ever since the disengagement and until these days. So for many Israelis, even those, as I told you before that even those who dream of greater Israel, the hardliners of the right wing in Israel, even those who believe in greater Israel, realize truly it cannot last forever. But on the other hand, on the other side of the political map, many Israelis who believe in the solution of two states for two people, many Israelis who believe that occupation should be over, that we should divide this country, that both people should live alongside one another between the sea and the river, they now realize we're going nowhere. There's no one to talk to. There's no partner. By the way, one thing that I realized, that in times of national emergency, our leaders tell us there's no reason to talk to. And when emergency is over, they say there's no one to talk to. So there's always a reason not to talk. But the point that I'm trying to make is the following. Be it as it may, if you are one of those who believe that occupation is the true curse of Israeli life, and if you're one of those who believe that we are a villa in the jungle, we should take no risks and cede no more territory to no more Palestinians, doesn't matter if you're one of these or one of these. The sad news is that many of us, many Israelis now, because of the process that I described to you, are disillusioned. If you want it or if you don't want it, you don't believe that it can ever happen. And I still, forgive my metaphorical language, I still have a dream. And I'll tell you what my dream is. I bet you that if courageous leadership rises on both sides of the border, on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, if courageous leadership rises, and if there's a moment of grace, everybody knows the end game. Everybody, guys, that's something that you have to bear in mind. Everybody knows the end game. Everybody knows it. It's not like, I don't know, the Hungarian cube, you know, this game that you have many ways to get to the result. No, the end game is clear. The end game is clear and is basically one. The division of the land between the sea and the river, dismantling of many settlements, many other settlements will be able to keep their place within clusters of Israeli settlements. No right of return to Palestinian refugees, because this is something that Israel will not be able to grant any time. And some kind of binational or international solution in Jerusalem. This is the end game. Many dissertations, many doctorates, many PhDs were earned on the way, but eventually the end game is clear. Academic mileage runs for free. The end game is clear. And I bet you something else. I bet you something else. If there is, or when there is a moment of grace, this end game, this general formula, I bet you 75% of Israelis will sign on to it. Even today, if there is courageous leadership and if there is a moment of grace. And I bet you 65% of Palestinians will sign on to it. Two-state solution, dismantling of many settlements, some kind of solution in Jerusalem, no right of return. The problem is that our 75% don't believe that their 65% even exist. And their 65% don't believe that our 75% even exist. The deeper problem, that our 25% and their 35% have made an unholy coalition to make sure that this moment of grace never happens. This is the real bad news. And I want to stop here and to open this conversation for a dialogue between us, because I can, no, I don't. I wanted to say that I can keep talking forever. I hope I cannot. I want you to engage and to ask anything you want and to say anything you feel, and we'll take it from there, and then I will wrap it up. Yes, please, if you can just say your name.
Yes, thank you for your time. My name is
I didn't get the name.
My name is Durab.
Okay.
The question I had for you, just in line with where you left off, you just mentioned 75% of the Israelis, 65% of the Palestinians would agree to that. And I'm sure there's a very thoughtful reason you chose these numbers. Well, not that they're precise, but the fact that one number is higher than the other.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what the reasons for that are, and if you think that that could be viewed as well, that's part of the problem, is that one side views the other as less, I guess, up to speed with facts.
You know, if it's easier for you, I can flip the numbers. But you're right. There is a reason. It's intuitive. The numbers are intuition, as you understand. But I guess the reason for the gap is that I have to be realistic. Listen. Watch at Gaza, okay? Ask yourself, how come almost 2 million Palestinians voted for Hamas, still vote for Hamas, still support Hamas, even though many of them, if not all of them, know that Hamas is using the population, the well-being of the population, the suffering of the population, the death of the population, the lack of electricity and running water, the ignorance. Hamas is using it for its own political and military and ideological goals. This is something which doesn't matter which side of the political map you come from. You have to realize it, you have to recognize it. So if you ask me why the gap, because I think that many Palestinians are still under the spell of the hope, the unrealistic, the dangerous hope that violence can lead them somewhere. Okay? So this is why I made the gap. Listen, there's something else that we should not ignore. I, as an Israeli, cannot ignore. Doesn't matter how critical I am of this government's policies, of my government's policies. Doesn't matter how worried I am of the dangers that these policies can bring with it. I have to realize something. The Palestinians, when they had the chance, they didn't take it back in 1947. But more important than that, and even sadder than that, is that the Palestinians became addicted, certainly in the last 2 decades, became addicted to a culture and a politics and a daily routine of death. I will tell you a story, okay? By the way, part of it can be justified, can be understood. You can see you can see the roots of it in despair, in poverty, in the fact that they have nothing to lose and nowhere to go. Of course, but the result is a society that cannot pull itself up from that misery and cannot detach itself from the culture and the policies and the ways and the habits of violence. And I'll give you an example, I'll tell you a story. At the height of the second Intifada, it was 2002, 2003, I got a call from our security services. And they told me that they apprehended a 15-year-old Palestinian in one of the stopovers. And they captured him with an explosive belt under his shirt. A young boy, less than 15 years old. And they said, we are willing to let you interview him. I didn't like the idea of him being used by our security services for purposes of Israeli propaganda. And I kind of thought if it's a good idea to interview him or not, and I decided to take my chances to come. Eventually, it was not me, it was our correspondent. She went there and she did the interview with him. But then I realized it would be a disaster if this is the way we run it. As you know, a young kid who is under arrest and he's being paraded by the Israeli security services. So I realized the one thing that I have to do is to go into Nablus, which is the town from which he came, and to look for his family and try to interview his mother or his father. And it was awkward because we're at the height of the Intifada. As I told you, I know that the guys that I'm going to meet, because I had to meet with the terrorist group there so that they take care of me, so that they make sure that nobody hurts me. So I made contact with one of the commanders of the terrorist groups in Nablus. And he said, are you coming personally? I said, yes, I'm coming. He knew me from television. And he said, if it's you, we vouch for your security. My husband told me it's fine, but just update your policy, your insurance policy. It's fine that he vouches for your security. Just let me know that everything is in order in terms of the paper. But I went there. And listen, it was crazy. It was crazy because his bodyguard met us just after we crossed the line. And we were with camera equipment and a lot of stuff, and it was heavy. And he insisted on carrying my stuff. He said, you're a lady, I have to carry your stuff. Now, he's the same guy who tomorrow will send a bus where my kid is riding to explode. But he was insisting on carrying my stuff and buying me lunch. Eventually, we found the mother of this kid. And I remember asking her, how come your boy thought that his life are worth it? How come your boy at the age of 15 was willing to die and to kill for what? And I remember her answering, my kid was about to be a shaheed, a martyr, and I could never be prouder of him. And I realized my ability to create a dialogue was very limited. I still tried to ask some questions, but I realized that there is, as mothers, as mothers, I couldn't find the meeting point. So that's partly the answer to the question, but that's not what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say, still there's a critical mass of people among the Palestinians and among the Israelis who only need the spark, the moment of grace and courageous leadership. Given reality, that's nothing small to aspire to. Yes, please.
Yes, hello, thank you for being here. My name is Tomas. I'm also from Argentina, so feeling proud. My question.
You know what they say about us, that you have to buy an Argentinian for what he thinks is valued and then to sell him. No, to buy him for what is valued and then to sell him for what he thinks his value is. But it makes two of us.
My question for you.
Aparte, arriba de boca es de noche.
I know, I'm very, very nervous. My question for you is, do you think there's freedom of speech in Israel now? Yes, no, or sometimes, and why?
The answer is unequivocally yes. The answer is unequivocally yes. And you will realize it anywhere you go. Listen, I want to tell you two things. When I have the opportunity to speak about freedom of speech in front of Israeli journalists or Israeli politicians or Israeli brass, then yes, I talk to them about the dangers. I talk to them about the fact that, for instance, in terms of artistic freedom, there is a bill running now in the Knesset according to which the Minister of Culture will have discretion in terms of subsidizing and funding and financing pieces of art or works of art or plays or cinema or what have you, and deny funding to works of art which preach against the existence of the State of Israel or preach in favor of terrorism and so forth. This, for instance, Tomas, is something which I oppose, okay? Although, bear in mind the criteria are very stiff and very rigid. It speaks only to works of art which are extremely subversive and work against the State of Israel, okay? And still I think it is terrible that even the body politic and the legislator in Israel even considers such a bill. And many of us, both in the Israeli culture scene and us journalists and reporters and other people, speak vehemently against it. And we try to explain that art and culture and film and theater and the press should not be loyal to anybody but themselves. And the only truth that we should promote is the truth of our creation, the truth of your art or your writing or your literature or what have you. And that the state should be proud to fund those works of art which run against it. It should invite it. It should invite opposition. It should invite subversiveness. So you ask me if I'm proud of that bill? I'm not. You ask me if I have any sympathy lost for that minister who is promoting it for her own political agenda? I'm not. But you ask me if the fight is here, the fight is here. And why is the fight here? Because we still speak. And we speak freely. And because you have on Israeli media, you have it all. You have the right and the left and the center says nothing and still we run it. And like everywhere else, like really everywhere else. And so really basically, you know, the kind of reports that we do that have to do with wrongdoings within the military, that have to do with corruption within the body politic, that have to do with the political discourse in Israel. Listen, the place where we both come from could learn some. I had a conversation once with a cousin of mine who still lives in Argentina, and he told me, you know how wealthy you could be in Argentina? I said, how come? He said, just on the money they would pay you not to run your pieces. So this is the place where we come from. Yes, please.
Your relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu is something that's characteristic of divisions in Israeli society, but it's also a phenomenon that we see around the world in the the Philippines, Hungary, Brazil, and in the United States.
Perhaps also in the United States. Yes, some would say.
Unquestionably, what are, in your opinion, then, for us as Americans and for you as Israeli, the obligations, the rights and responsibilities that the press has to political leadership and that political leadership has to the press?
What's your name?
Sam.
Sam. Truth is that when I watch your president on television and our prime minister on television, I end up not knowing who is the original, who's the copycat. Denominator is no secret. They both, and it's important to understand, they both cater to their base, unlike other political strategies. It is not the only political strategy. The political strategy selected by Trump and Netanyahu is focused on their hardcore political base. Unlike other leaders in history who are trying to cater to many in the outskirts of their political base, right? No, their dialogue is with their political base. Why is that important? Because for both of them, the ability to the ability to point out to anybody outside this base and characterize them as the enemies of the nation is part of that strategy, because that's what the base wants to hear. Be it immigrants, be it gays, be it Arabs, be it the media, be it the judges, be it the Attorney General, be it the police, be it the FBI, right? This is the political strategy. Where is the bad? Well, the bad news is all over the place. But where's the real bad news? The real bad news is that the problem is that we have ceased being a liability for them. When we run our investigative work, it's not a liability, it's an asset. It's an asset. When we ran this report about the decision-making process within the Prime Minister's environment, and then he sent us this weird, strange, awkward, violent response, which I read for 6.5 minutes on camera. I have to tell you that when I finished reading it, and it was pre-recorded, it wasn't live, I finished reading it, and I remember that all of us, the editor of the program was there, the cameraman who knew nothing about what I'm about to read, and he had smoke coming out his ears. He couldn't even realize what it is that I'm saying, that I'm cursing myself on camera for 6.5 minutes, because that's what the Prime Minister sent us. A series of slanders about me. None of them were true other than the spelling of my name. But I realized that's the right thing to say, to just read it in full in front of the camera. And then something happened. The makeup artist, she's a lady who works with me for 32 years. So ever since I was 3 or 4 years old. And she approached me. And she told me, Ilana, bear in mind, I know that you feel now very brave. She could tell me the truth. I know that you feel like you did something important, that you stood in front of the camera and you read it in full, and you are sure that the audience will understand that he is lying, that he is telling stuff about you, much like the same stuff that, that the day, what happened the day after our broadcast? Trump was elected president. So we didn't know by then that in a while Trump will call names, you call the media names, and will tell Jim Acosta what he thinks about him. But back then, the makeup artist told me, Ilana, bear in mind, you feel very proud of yourself right now. Bear in mind that many people will believe every word he said about you. No, many people will not get the irony. Many people will think that you are indeed this radical leftist that he's speaking about. Many people will believe him and not you. And it took me a while to understand, A, that she's right, and B, that there's something that I can do about it. And the something that I can do is to realize that he is not my enemy. For him, I'm his enemy because that's part of his political strategy. For me, he's not my enemy, he's my prime minister. And as such, I will keep criticizing him. And as such, I will keep covering him. And as such, I will keep exposing him for what he is. Now, take a moment to realize that this phenomena of Bibi Netanyahu doesn't come from nowhere. Unlike Trump. Trump came from nowhere. There you had the reality TV star who decided one day that he bought enough real estate, now he wants to buy the White House. By the way, he didn't really buy it. He did something much smarter than that. Bibi is no Trump. Bibi is someone who brought himself up to become the leader of this country. He went through every right point in time. He was a commander in Sayeret Matkal, in the same unit that you visited. He was an MIT graduate. He's well educated. He's an intellectual. He's the son of a professor of Jewish history. He breathes and lives and feels Jewish history and Jewish destiny in every fiber of his body and soul. So when he becomes prime minister in May of 1996, Netanyahu, from his point of view, got to the exact point where destiny was leading him for all his life. He was only 46 years old. He was very young. And he became prime minister. Guys, rightly so. Rightly so, because he was able, he's still able. And he was smart, he's still smart. And he felt like he's the right person for the right place. And many Israelis, after the collapse of the Oslo Accords and after Rabin's assassination, by the way, perhaps even before Rabin's assassination, it might very well be the case that Bibi Netanyahu would have been elected prime minister even if Rabin was not assassinated. We will never know, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, Netanyahu is elected prime minister for the first time, May of 1996. You know what happens? Many of my friends in the media, in the liberal part of Israeli society, in the elites, in the left, they perceive it almost as a personal insult. How come this guy becomes prime minister? We never elected him. Of course you didn't, but many other Israelis did. Democratically, legitimately. No questions asked. They wanted him, they still want him to be prime minister. So Bibi is no Trump. Bibi was elected time and again ever since, A, because many Israelis believe he's the right leader for these times, and B, because he believes it so deeply that he makes it happen. He has the stamina, the energy, the obsession, the political ability, the skills, and the intellect. Again, unlike Trump. He has it. It's a different story. Bibi is a different story. It is a different story. But then comes 2015. 2015, his government is in danger. He realizes that Labour might win the election. And against all odds, doesn't matter how and exactly the details, he wins again for the fourth time. He's elected prime minister. Bibi, after the last elections, is a different Bibi. Because he did it against all odds, with his hands tied behind his back, because he did it almost alone. I mean, he was the architect, the strategist, the pollster, the everything. And he won it alone. So he comes to this prime minister office in March of 2015 as somebody much more confident. The world is changing in a short while when Trump is elected president in the US. And Bibi becomes much more confident, and he takes revenge at everybody who was against him for those years. At the media, at the courts, at the attorney general, at the police, at everyone. A, because it's wise strategy. B, because it's something that he needs to do. So is Bibi good news for Israel? There's no simple answer for that. First of all, it's a matter of ideology. Some people say this, some people say the other thing. But something you have to bear in mind. This guy comes to work every day. Believe me, believe him. This guy comes to work every day with the destiny of the Jewish people on his shoulders. And the second thing that you have to bear in mind, and I'm telling you that as someone who had already 3 kids in the military. The third is now serving. And 2 have already been, are out of the service already. Bibi Netanyahu spared us another war this summer in Gaza and also last week in Gaza. He's paying a high political toll for it nowadays within his coalition. And he did it because he realizes that another round of violence against Hamas will only bring us back to square one, with one difference, with many casualties on our side and many more on their side, if we engage in another round of violence. So it takes a strong and popular prime minister like Bibi with a political capital to spare for him to be able not to drag us into an unnecessary war in Gaza. I'll tell you something which I will never say in public, although it's really public. If it were only for that, if it were only for that, I thank God that he was the one in charge during the last couple of weeks and not somebody else. Because somebody, even from the left or the left of center, perhaps wouldn't be as confident and as able to spare us another war. That's not to say that I would want my daughter to marry him or something like that. But then he's already married for the third time. He doesn't need my daughter. Yeah. Wait a minute. There's a gender problem here. I didn't call on any lady. I will be with you in a moment, okay? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm actually an officer in the U.S. Army. And I'm curious to if you think the U.S. government and military should be involved in helping Israel achieve a peaceful solution, and if so, what concrete actions do you think the U.S. should continue to take, or how should we change direction?
You know, I'm really careful in answering these questions because I'm no geopolitical analyst. It doesn't matter if I think it's necessary or not. I think from an American point of view, even the nationalistic, isolationist Trump understands that America needs to be engaged in this area, A, that America's alliance with Israel means that America has a role in promoting a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians because it is our ally, because it is Israeli interest to promote a dialogue. Even, by the way, Sarah, even if there is no peace behind the corner, the mere existence of a dialogue, the mere infusion of hope within both sides of the border, this is something which is so important. I think the Americans understand it. So will they come with how does he call it, the deal of the century? I don't know. Will it lead anywhere? I don't know. I know it's better that we have it than we don't. Yes, I'm with you now.
I'm curious, you said that the political strategy of appealing to your base and sort of winning based on that is popular here. It seems to be popular in America and in many other parts of the world right now. I guess, why do you think that this time in history seems to be popular everywhere? And how do we
the strategy of Bibi and Trump?
The strategy of democratically elected leaders appealing to a base and then being able to combat the media and all of that. And how do we get past it? Or will we get past
it? Wow, that's not a question for a dissertation. That's a question for 100 dissertations. What is your name? Ani. There's a book that I don't know if it's in English already, but it's one of the best books that I read recently. It's called The Revolt Against Globalization. It's written by a foreign news editor of a news channel in Israel. I hope it will be translated to English because it kind of answers your question. And I know that there's an amazing series of reports. I don't remember if I think it's on The Atlantic, about the fall of liberal democracies all over the world, from Hungary to Poland, from Turkey to the US, from Israel to Peru and Argentina and what have you. I think part of it has to do with the price of globalization. I'm no expert, but I've read this book and I've read everything I can about the Trump phenomena and the Bibi phenomena, and I think the fact, like in the US for sure, the fact that too many people feel like they've been left behind. Many of them indeed were left behind by globalization and by other processes, led and endorsed by liberal Democrats. This was the capital, the electoral capital on which Trump built his popularity. Now, when it comes to Israel, instead of the feeling of being left behind in terms of economic mobility or ability, in Israel it has to do with the fears that I was talking to you about. If there's something that Bibi is the greatest expert in history of, is mixing true fears with false ones, mixing true tragedy with imaginary one, mixing true existential threats with unexisting ones. And in every kind of conspiracy, if you have a grain of truth, it can lead you anywhere. This is the expertise. And he knows that we live the fear for my kid at the bus station, the fear of the Holocaust survivor, the fear of Jewish tragedy. Now, that doesn't mean the fact that we have these fears, and they are true, it doesn't mean that somebody is now out there to get us. No, there is no existential threat on the state of Israel today, period. You will hear it from the chief of staff, from the chief of the security services, from the chief of Mossad, and from Bibi in a moment of candor, if you find it. Okay? You will hear it from him. There's no existential threat. And not from Iran either. Okay? No. None whatsoever. Still, he needs it to breed the kind of popularity. Now, you ask me rightly, why does it lead? I mean, what's the connection between that and the ability of these leaders, to say it's dark out there? Right? What was it? Did you hear the last tweet by, I guess it's not the last, by Trump? That there's a wave of cold now in the US. And he says, where are these clowns with global warming? So now he's got the proof there is no global warming because there's snow in DC. So it means there is no global warming. So he asked me, what's the connection between all these deep and historical processes and the fact that you have leaders who have no problem lying and no problem steering the diversity and steering controversy and steering hate and using hate as political stamina? I guess there are explanations in the way. But the basic explanation is the ability of one of them to cater to those who are left behind and the other to cater to those who are fearful of tomorrow. I guess that sums it up. Yes, please. What's your name?
My name is Tawanda.
Tawanda.
If the wounds of the Holocaust are still so fresh, then what's the inner voice of the Israeli people when it comes to African refugees trying to come to Israel? The 40,000
It's a great question. That's a great question. The answer is that it depends which Israeli you ask. And I'll tell you something. Many of us are, not only many of us, the government, the Israeli government, last spring, less than a year ago, signed an arrangement endorsed by the UN to give almost 20,000 illegal immigrants permit to stay in this country, to legalize them, and then to take care of the rest of them. And then Netanyahu, by the way, got scared from the response of his political base. Within 24 hours, he revoked his signature. But now they are trying to get back to it. Is Israel as tolerant, as humane, as welcoming as I would want it to be? No. Are Israelis still carrying the sentiment that says, we have been victims once, we know how it feels to be a victim today? I think many of us do. And I have to tell you that our kids travel to the concentration camps. Most of them when they are 17, 18. And I remember when I sat down to write a letter to my oldest daughter when she traveled there for the first time. Then she traveled later when she was an officer in the military. And the first time I wrote a letter to her, I wrote about my mother's grandparents that were killed in the Holocaust, and about 2 of her uncles, and like more than a dozen of her cousins. And I wrote about my husband's side. He doesn't write those letters, so I had to bring the voice of his family too. And then I told her, I wrote this letter, listen, Yaeli, when you will be there in Auschwitz, you will take, I bet some of your friends will take the Israeli flag and wrap your body with the Israeli flag. And they will tell you there, your instructors, that Israel is the response to Auschwitz, that the military is a revenge after Auschwitz. Don't believe them. It's not. Israel is the place which saved us after Auschwitz. If we take it as a response to Auschwitz, we will forget the universal, humane, true, important lesson of Auschwitz. And I remember writing to her, and I had to write these letters later to her siblings, so I remember that. Don't believe it when they tell you, if they hit you once, you have to hit harder. No, if they hit you once, you know that it hurts. You know how it feels to be a victim. You know what suffering feels like. This is the lesson of Auschwitz. Now you ask me, is the state of Israel carrying this promise today? I think partly yes and partly no. And I think there's a deep dispute within the Israeli society, which, by the way, the question that you asked and the response that I gave you can be the poster. The poster of the story of the Israeli story nowadays. Are we the victims or are we the victimizers? Do we remember the story and the lesson of being a victim, or do we translate it into being a victimizer? Many Israelis understand the humane lesson of the Holocaust. Not all of us practice it. And partly because reality has not been nice to us ever since. Because fear is still here. Remember that I told you about David Grossman, the Israeli author? I read once an article that he wrote. I did an interview with him before the 2013 elections. And in the 2013 elections, it was one of those times in which Israelis didn't want to hear about the conflict. Leave me alone with the conflict. Let me be with my problems, domestic stories, domestic issues, economy, the social fabric. Didn't want to deal with the conflict. And David Grossman came to the interview and he said, you know what? Nobody wants to speak for peace. I take it upon myself to speak for peace. If we don't work for peace, we will have no good economy. We will have no good social fabric. We will have no social mobility. Our kids will not be able to go to Stanford, to Berkeley, to Harvard, to Yale even to study. If we don't work, even to Yale, if we don't work on that conflict, there's nowhere we can go. And then we were both reminded of something that he wrote once. Because he told me, when he said these things, this left-wing kind of lingo, I asked him, but you understand that many Israelis are disillusioned because you leftists keep speaking about peace, but Palestinians keep killing us in the streets. You understand that there's a reason that Israelis don't want to hear about that peace of yours anymore, because it doesn't go anywhere. And I remember him answering me, he said, can you give me the answer to this question? Every time there is an opportunity to fight a war, we grab that opportunity. We go to the borders and we fight it. Why is it that after a fiasco, one fiasco, the Oslo fiasco, of making peace, we don't try it anymore? We keep trying war time and again. Why is it that war we don't try the peace we don't try one time and again? And then we both were reminded of something that he wrote many years ago. And he wrote that the Israeli, consumed by his fears or her fears, kind of wears an armor. Like the medieval knights, we wear a heavy armor. And when you wear this heavy armor, it's tough for you to climb a tree. And then he wrote in this article, if you want to get to a peaceful solution, you have to climb that tree. When you climb a tree, in order to hold on to the higher branch, you have to let go on the lower branch. It's scary. You might fall. If you are consumed with your fears, you will never let go on the lower branch. And therefore, you will never hang on to the higher branch. This is part of the story. Yes, please.
We've heard a lot about the current alignment with Sunni states in opposition to Iran, producing a number of people have said this is the strongest position Israel's been in because of that relationship. Can you talk about what you think of that relationship with other Sunni states? Also from a journalistic point of view of being critical, what kind of responsibility there is to talk about what's happening in Yemen and association with Saudis in that kind of context?
I'll try to be modest, although journalists seldom are. But it's not something which I feel that, that is within my field of expertise. I do understand the general direction of your question, which is, do we have to bring moral considerations into account when we preserve or promote an alliance with the Saudis, given what they did in Turkey the last month, or given what they do in Yemen and so forth? And I have to be very honest with you. And I say it really modestly because it's not within my field of expertise. Israel cannot be really picky. We are a villa in the jungle. We do need allies. And it's not like we can have them perfect. And it's not like they come, you know, in a present package, impeccable and flawless. That is not to say that we can make an alliance with anybody, anytime, anywhere. But I bet that there are bigger experts than me that can give you better answers. Yes, please.
My name is Josh, and thank you for coming. We've heard a lot of references to the Israeli base and how they support Bibi. Can you give us a bit of perspective on how the base thinks about some of these issues and why they do choose to support Bibi?
First of all, I have to tell you, Josh, that sometimes I think about this base, and we've never met him, this base. Even in the States, I mean, the base can be the coal miner in Pennsylvania, right? But it's also an insurance agent in Colorado. And this insurance agent in Colorado, she drinks red wine for lunch. She doesn't look like the coal miner in Pennsylvania, but they both voted Trump. And the ex-Israeli physician in Northern California that I met a couple of years ago, and also votes Trump. So who is this base? And I ask myself, much like you ask me, when the coalition, Bibi's coalition, passes a law that has to do with surrogacy, which can be helpful for gay couples to have kids, and they exclude the gay population. I mean, it's exclusively for single mothers or single unwedded women, whatever. And of course, many Israelis think that it's wrong. But that was a result of a political consideration having to do with the Haredim, with the Orthodox parties who are part of the coalition, okay? So you ask yourself, and I ask myself, is Bibi's base anti-gay? Of course not. Does the base care if gay people will be able to bring kids? Of course not. You should see Tel Aviv. When is the gay parade in Tel Aviv? In the summer sometime. You should see Tel Aviv in the summer. By the way, a friend of mine told me a while ago that Tel Aviv became straight-friendly. It is straight-friendly. So what does it mean, Josh? What does it mean? The fact that Tel Aviv is considered one of the most gay-friendly cities in the world, attracting amazing numbers of tourists. And Tel Aviv, as you all know, Tel Aviv in a way is not Israel. But it also is. What does it say about the base? So if you ask me, I think that the base is many, many things. It's not like what we would imagine. Extreme, right-wing, Arab haters and gay bashes. No, it's not. I think if there is one common denominator to the people who vote Bibi, well, there is not one common denominator, but it would be A, that they see no alternative, no reasonable alternative. B, that they think that his risk management formula is better than any other in terms of if we cede any other territory or any other assets to the Arabs. And C, that they believe that I think C is something else. C is a tribal issue. Israel is a tribal society in a way, just in a way. And many Israelis whose fathers, whose parents and grandparents were followers of the Likud feel part of this tribe and feel that the loyalty to that party, to Likud, led now by Netanyahu, for many years now by Netanyahu, is more important than most anything else. And I remember that a couple of years ago I did an interview with Martin Indyk, who was the American ambassador to the US. And he told me a story which can be sort of the short answer to your question. He told me that back in 1997, Clinton was the president, and Ambassador Indyk conveyed a message to the Israeli Prime Minister, just elected, Bibi Netanyahu, from the American president, because Israel was about to pass a resolution that had to do with building another settlement nearby Jerusalem. And the American administration wanted to prevent it. Clinton thought that was not a good idea. And Indy came to Bibi and said, that's what my president told me to tell you. And Bibi told him, I'm sorry, Martin, but I won't be able to accept the president's request. And he said, why? And Bibi told him in very short words, because I have to feed my tribe. I have to feed my tribe. And I think, again, much like Trump, he understands this is, in a way, the key to the motor of Israeli politics, part of the response to the question. I'll take 2 last questions. Yes, please.
So you spoke earlier to the end game that everyone generally understands with regard to the two-state solution and the future of Jerusalem as a means of establishing some amount of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. What I'm curious about is, like, if you could speak to the end game internally to Israel territories around the future of Arab Israelis who are not living in Palestinian territories.
No, wait a minute. I didn't get the question. So you understand the end game, and the question is?
I wonder if you speak to the end game with regard to the 20% of the Israeli population that is Arab, and how you.
Now I understand the question. Basically speaking, it's not part of the game and therefore not part of the end game. I mean, if you ask Sofiane, I think I don't want to speak on her behalf, she would tell you she's a female, she's an Arab, she's a Bedouin, and she's an Israeli, right? Not necessarily in that order. She will decide the order. Perhaps she will change her mind in terms of the order. But that's what she will tell you. Now, other Arab Israelis perhaps will tell you, I feel more Palestinian than any other thing, but they would still acknowledge, most of them, that they're Israelis, that they are very critical, and rightly so, of the way they are treated in many ways. And you know what's amazing? The amazing thing is the difference between what happens on the political arena with terrible, unnecessary, even racist bills which are considered, and I'm really glad and proud to tell you that most of these bills will not pass the scrutiny of the Supreme Court of Israel. Between that and between what happens on campus, in the universities, in our MIT, if you walk the lawns of Israel's MIT in Haifa, most female you will see are Arab females. In engineering, in architecture, in medicine, pharmaceutical, which I hope will cease being the only profession because it's considered an Arab profession. You will see professionals. If you take the statistics of those who excel in high school, in mathematics, in physics, in science, you have the best numbers in some of the Arab high schools. So the grassroots, the territory, the day-to-day reality is much better than higher politics. That is not to say that we don't have a way to go, but that's the answer to your question. The end game is here. We just have to take it. Last question, I think.
Yes, is it me?
Yeah.
So I'm from Mexico, I'm Tania, and I was wondering, you told Tommy that...
In Mexico I could also be, también podía recibir mucho dinero vendiendo mis... Dinero, you understand, huh? That's why you get an MBA, to understand dinero.
Yeah. So I was wondering, what do places in Latin America can learn from Israel, or should learn?
You know what? My father unfortunately passed away 8 years ago. But I had this conversation with him so many times because he loved Argentina. And he felt, as much as he felt Israeli and Zionist and Jewish, he felt South America. He really loved Argentina. And I kept asking him, listen, can you explain it to me? This land of yours, Argentina, so rich, so vast, so big, so peaceful. Nobody ever had anything to do other than the Falklands. Nobody ever threatened Argentina with anything. How come you screwed yourself so many times over and over again? And the same goes for Mexico, and the same goes for Colombia and Peru, and Chile is another story now, right? And I think someone once, I visited just once or twice Argentina ever since we made Aliyah, and someone told me in Argentina it's like someone came there, say 150, 200 years ago, started to build something, and then stopped in the middle. And that's how Argentina looks. And that's how Argentinian democracy looks. And that's why it's vulnerable, much like Uruguay and Chile and Mexico. It's vulnerable to violence, to guerrilla, to undemocratic forces taking over. I think it's because something that has to do with the DNA, something that has to do with the fucked up political culture. Basically, that's it. And I think, yes, there's much to be learned from Israel. There's much to be learned from a nation which is not flawless, and not without problems, and not without unwanted trends and tendencies, but with a basic, deep democratic DNA, a basic need to quarrel, to dispute, to argue, to find a better way. Not always we do that. Not always we get to the better way, but we always try. I'll take now really the last question, because
What is the path you think from where we are today?
didn't understand anything.
What is the path from where we are today, which is relatively conservative here, to the courageous leadership you were talking about?
How do we go from here to there?
Yeah. And will you ever run for office?
They say never, but they are wrong. Now you know why? I was 19 years old when I was a parliamentary correspondent. And like they say in Hebrew, "Ra'iti," I've seen them. I've seen them in their moments of disgrace, and I've seen them in their political petty acting, and I don't want ever to be part of them. I want to cover them and then to go back home safely. But instead of answering your question of how do we get from here to there, I will leave you with something which is kind of food for thought, and it has to do with the question. Remember that and I'll sum it up with that. Remember that I mentioned David Grossman? For me, he's the greatest Israeli author. And if you ever have the chance to take his last book, it's not his last book, it's one before the last. It's called in English, Till the End of the Land. And way back then, when America had a president who actually read books, Obama said that he took it with him on vacation to read it. So that's David Grossman. David Grossman was writing this book when his younger or middle son joined the military. He completed writing this book, a book about a woman who decides to run from the bad news of her son being killed in the war. In Hebrew, it's called Isha Borachat Mibsora, a woman running away from news. And the news is that her son was killed in the war. And she decides, this mother, when she brings her son to the point from which he is recruited, she comes back home, she knows that bad news is after her. She knows that something bad will happen to him. And you know there's this terrible ceremony when they come and knock on your door, the doctor and the psychologist and the young lady from the military to tell you that your son was killed in action. And this lady, the heroine of David Grossman's book, she decides to run away, to break the deal with the country. If I'm not there, news will not be delivered. If it's not delivered, he will not die. And then she goes on a journey, which is an amazing journey, and it captures her life and her husband's life and her lover's life, and it's a huge epic story. And David completed writing this book by the summer of 2006. His second son was already serving in the military. Days after David completed the last draft of the book, his son Uri was killed in the Lebanon war. And it became a terrible, it's not even a coincidence, a terrible story of Israeli existence. And I want to leave you with the words that David Grossman said on his son's grave. I came to the funeral even though I didn't know, my acquaintance with David Grossman was much closer after the war. But during that war, during the Lebanon war, before his son was killed, he called me one day when I was driving south from the Lebanon border after shooting a story on the Lebanon border. And I was driving back home. It was late at night. The war was still going on. And David called me and said, I want to be interviewed on your radio show. I want you to bring me on the air because I want to tell everybody that this war should stop, that it's taking us nowhere. I want to talk to the government, but I have one thing that I want to ask you. My son Uri is there in the war. Please don't ask me about that and don't tell anything about that because my parents, his grandparents don't know that he's in the war and I don't want them to worry. So please don't ask me about that. I didn't ask. A week later, Uri was killed. And because I've already had this contact with David, I came to the funeral. And I want to leave you, and that goes partly to a question, with what he said about his son in the funeral. He talked about Uri. And he said that Uri was gam vegam, tambien y tambien, that Uri was both. He was both a war hero because he wanted to fight, but he was also a great humanist who kept coming home from the military and telling his parents about the way he feels towards the Palestinian population that he engages with. He was both a fighter, a tank commander, and a theater lover. He wanted to study theater. He wanted to write, and he wanted to go on stage. He was both. He was gam vegam. And David said in his eulogy, he said that he learned from Uri that we can be gam vegam, that we can be both. And that's what he said. He said, yes, we should be both. We need to protect ourselves. In Hebrew you say, la'amod al nafshenu, which means both to protect our lives and to protect our soul. But that means both saving our lives and saving our soul. Saving it, and listen to that, saving it from the simplistic thinking, from the corrupting effects of cynicism, from the pollution of the heart, and from the perils of diminishing the other. This is the true curse threatening those who live in a disaster area like ours. Now, can we be both? Can we both defend our lives and care for the lives of the others? Can we be both a democracy and a Jewish state? Can we be both a nation committed to human rights and a nation committed to saving itself and protecting itself? Can we be gam vegam? Can we be both, like Uri was? Again, I would invoke another president from another time. Yes, we can. Or else we won't be at all. Thank you very much, guys. Shabbat shalom.